David, thank you for calling in from Tennessee. And thank you for the work you've been doing for many years and the writing you've been doing, most recently writing about the threat of secession, about division, and about the prospect of restoring our nation. And it's interesting, I just want to note that right from the start, you say restoring our nation and not, for example, restoring our union. And maybe we can get to that in a bit. Before we jump in, an awkward moment while I say thanks to some of the organizations that have made this possible, this event and many others. First, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Oregon Cultural Trust, Northwest Natural, Tonkin Torp, Stoll Reeves, the Kinsman Foundation, and the City of Portland's We Are Better Together program. This particular program was funded by the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative through the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and it's co-sponsored by the Portland League of Women Voters. Thank you to all of those organizations. So, David, you're calling in from Tennessee. I'm talking to you from Portland, Oregon. Echoes of difference and division already in that fact. And I want to start kind of softly, and I want to ask sports teams. Do you have a favorite team or two?
Oh, for sure. I mean, so I was born in Alabama. I grew up in Louisiana, Tennessee, and Kentucky. So I'm about the most representative Southeastern Conference football fan that you could possibly find. So because I was born in Auburn, I'm an Auburn football fan. Because I spent most of my time growing up in Kentucky, I'm a Kentucky basketball fan, which is a great combination because I'm usually good in the fall and in the winter. Professionally, I'm just the local teams. I mean, I love the Tennessee Titans and I'm mainly a basketball fan. So Memphis Grizzlies, I love the Memphis Grizzlies. And just in my newsletter today, I'm trying to get my newsletter readers to vote for Ja Morant for NBA All-Star. So Josh, but I like the Blazers. I mean, how can you be a basketball fan and not enjoy watching Dame Lillard play basketball?
Okay, so well said. You sort of know how to win the audience over. And I will say something I've been thinking about as we've been moving toward this event is how different it would feel in person. Because I think some of the things we talk about, we'd be able to hear and feel how people might be responding to specific questions. And so when you would say Dame Lillard, there would be applause. There probably would be for Ja Morant, but it would be a different kind. And then when people say Auburn football or even Kentucky basketball, I think that just wouldn't land here. And the reason
blank looks maybe.
maybe. And I kind of wanted to ask about that because it seems like those allegiances are often rooted in place. And they also represent a certain kind of difference or even division that we're generally pretty comfortable with and maybe even happy about.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is you actually raise a really important and interesting thing about how the different affections we feel for sort of hearth and home in our own city and our own community can actually create a sense of fellowship with others and in an interesting way. And in that way, I'm referring to a book written by the Christian theologian C.S. Lewis, a book called The Four Loves. And he talks about the four loves are, the love of God, sexual love, friendship, and affection. And he talks about how the love of home, of place, this affection of the places we grew up, of the places that we know, sort of its familiar sights and smells and sounds and all of that, it can also create a good attitude towards others because it says, and this is C.S. Lewis talking, how can I love my home without coming to realize that other men no less rightly love theirs? So it's one of the reasons why sports in some ways can have a unifying effect, even though we're cheering wildly for one team over another, because we can I understand why you would root for the Blazers and Dame Lillard, and I'm rooting for the Grizzlies and Ja Morant, and we can have a connection over that shared love of our homes. And so the fact that I love something does not automatically set me against somebody who loves something or someplace else.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting out here, and I should say I'm a Bulls fan first and foremost. Yeah, that's Chicago, and that's going to be in there till I'm gone. That's in so deep that's the deepest. And I do love Dame and the Blazers, but there's a game that's played out here usually between the University of Oregon and Oregon State that had been called the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just been a recent decision not to keep calling it that. I think because the echoes of something called the Civil War right now feel too live.
Right.
And so in a way, again, sticking or moving from sports to politics, but also maybe to some of the other things you've already pointed us to. And there, the word fellowship has to me a spiritual or religious sound to it.
Mm-hmm.
And much of, I think, your book about the threat of secession also has religion threaded heavily through it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll just ask the question right now, especially since it's been a little bit since the book came out. Secession, does it feel like a real threat to you right now?
Not right now, but the way the book is crafted, it basically has three segments. One is what is the problem now?
Mm-hmm.
And number two is how could that problem, if it continues to remain unaddressed, not immediately, not right away, but how could these trends that are separating us, that are pulling us apart more than pushing us together, if you keep pulling apart, what are the consequences of that? And then the last part is how can we address it or deal with it? And so the basic premise of the book is right in paragraph number 1, which says we cannot guarantee the continued unity of the U.S. Why? Because there is no truly important cultural or political or religious or social trend that is pulling us together more than it's pushing us apart. And if you keep and you carry that out in not a day over day or week over week or month over month, but year over year, I look at it this way. It's like, imagine that you're building a bonfire and you're putting the kindling in, you're putting the dry wood on it. Maybe you're even putting some lighter fluid on it. All it takes is after a while, you're going to reach a point at which it will not be hard to light that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I made that analogy quite a bit in September and October when my book first came out, and people agreed with that intellectually, but it didn't land emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
When I made the analogy in December and then January, people were like, yep, I see it. And I've seen it on January 6th. Think about how close we came.
Yeah.
It was already a historic event. The Capitol was taken by a hostile force to an extent not seen since the War of 1812. Mm-hmm. That's already a massive American historical event. We came so close to the possibility of a vice president of the United States, a speaker of the House, multiple members of the House or Senate being killed on live television.
Yeah.
And had that occurred, I don't know where we'd be right now. And so that's what I mean when I first wrote the book. I got to admit, I was a little nervous because as an intellectual matter, I could see where this could lead into secession. As a sort of emotional matter, I was hearing more, and an anecdotal matter, I was hearing more and more people around me where I lived and where I interacted saying, I don't want to live around these people anymore. But as a public matter, would people see the book as excessively alarmist? Because it included the S word, secession. Like, lots of people are down with the idea that we're polarized.
Right.
But secession, really? And then now I don't get those questions anymore. Like, people are like, oh yeah, I could see how that could happen.
But you're also, you were talking and now are talking about that potential bonfire, which was lit to some extent from the right. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting take, is that sort of your own position and also the risk you yourself have incurred in talking in that way. And it's made me wonder even about, when I hear secession, I immediately think, as your book plays out, like you give us these two scenarios, Texit and Calexit. I probably mispronounced both, but
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
California leading one departure or Texas leading another departure. It feels to me like there's at least now there's kind of divisions within each side that have
Yeah.
also, the heat is so I want to ask you about that. Why is the heat so strong for you, let's say, as a critic on the right?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I was puzzled by it for a while until I had a key conversation where I was like, "Oh, yeah, okay, this totally makes sense." And I've been working and talking with a lot of people who've done a lot of conflict resolution and study of conflict in the developing world, and people who specialize in trying to resolve civil wars. Lebanon, for example, or thinking about Iraq or Syria. And some of these individuals have now started to turn their gaze towards the United States because they're seeing some of the dysfunctions in the United States that they've seen overseas in countries that have been struggled with actual violent division. And I was talking to one individual. She's a scholar of radicalization and overseas conflict, and she's spending more time talking about the U.S. And we were talking about my experience and the attacks and threats that I've endured, my wife has endured, that my kids, especially my youngest daughter, has endured since we opposed Donald Trump. And I was walking her through it, and she said, "Oh, yes, of course. In a revolutionary environment, the first target is the in-group dissenter, or what she would call the in-group moderate." So in other words, if you're going to sort of gird your loins for combat, so to speak, you need to make sure that your team is a unified force. And dissent within your side, therefore, becomes seen as, especially as you're escalating your political conflict, dissent within your side isn't disagreement, it's betrayal. So you're always going to have more fury for the traitor than you are for the enemy. If you were going to talk to a colonist and a colonial soldier, member of the Continental Line heading to Yorktown, would you say that they dislike Cornwallis more or Benedict Arnold more? They would likely say Benedict Arnold. And so that sense of treason or betrayal to your own side creates a level of vitriol that can get very, very dangerous.
And I kind of want to ask you about that for a minute for a couple of reasons. First, I just want to ask what that has felt like, and then I think I have a more intellectual question to follow. But what has that felt like for
It's
you?
horrible. It's horrible. I mean, and the thing is, the temptation is to say, "Oh, it doesn't bother me," because you want to sort of present this front to the world that says, you people who have, for example, my youngest daughter is African American. And people in 2015, when she was only 7 years old, photoshopped her face into gas chambers online, photoshopped her face into slave fields, like old photographs of slaves. And you say, that's horrible. That's evil. That is, I'm just so thankful that she didn't see all of that in real time.
Right.
And then it escalated, actual threats against my wife, hacking into phone calls between my wife and her father, death threats. Cesar Soyak, who the guy who sent bombs to a lot of Trump opponents, searched for my home address. I mean, I could just keep going and going on these things, and it's terrible. I mean, there's no way of saying, "Oh yeah, this doesn't bother me." That would be weird to say that. So yeah, but at the same time, it redoubles my commitment to facing these forces that are they're just evil. I mean, there's no other word around that sort of element of the right-wing fringe. It's just evil. So it might be miserable to endure, but it redoubles your conviction to face it.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. First of all, it's more than interesting. It's sad and it's enraging to hear that. And so I just want to take a moment and not move past that too fast. And I know it's continuing, and I suspect the courage it takes to speak about this from the right is more than I can imagine, because it's not going away.
Mhm.
I still want to push into it and ask a little bit about the very last thing you just said was they're just evil.
Mhm.
And in a way, that the thing about that phrase that I want to stick with a little bit is it seems like that's getting said without cause much more than it used to be. And when I say without cause, I mean with a great deal of conviction, but without the kind of pattern of evidence that you've just
Yeah.
talked about. So why is that, do you think? Why is it that on both sides or on multiple sides, we seem so much readier now to say they're just evil?
Yeah. Well, there's a long, complicated answer to that. And that's a word I use advisedly. I do not use that word to describe people I disagree with.
Yeah.
Even people I disagree with on really important issues, on issues that are, matters of war and peace, matters of life and death, matters of eternal significance, religious disagreements. I don't use that word to describe people unless is a pattern, not just of disagreement with me, but of cruelty and malice that's obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And again, disagreement is not cruelty. Disagreement is not malice. So there's a couple of things that are happening, and this is an ideal platform to talk about it because you're coming to me from Portland, which is pretty darn blue.
Yes.
I'm talking to you from Franklin, Tennessee, which is pretty darn red.
Yeah.
Is Portland Multnomah County?
It is. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
So you're in Multnomah County. I'm in Williamson County. Williamson County is what's called a landslide county. And I'm sure Multnomah County is too, which is one party or the other wins in a presidential race by 20 points or more.
Yeah.
And so this is part of the big sort,
Right.
Blue folks living in like-minded communities, red folks living in like-minded communities. And what my book talks about, and this is a very important concept, and that is that when like-minded people gather, they tend to become more extreme.
Yeah.
So when there's no sort of check on the group dynamic and the group momentum propelling you in one direction, you just go. And this comes from a paper from Cass Sunstein in 1999, I believe. And he uses some examples. And for example, let's say everyone in the room disagrees with gun control and supports Second Amendment, broader gun rights. If you don't have somebody who supports gun control in that room, you're going to deal with straw man arguments. Mm-hmm. You're going to be mutually reinforcing and sort of have that sense of fellowship that you have with people of shared point of view. Mm-hmm. And you're going to walk out of that room, not just more committed to gun rights, you might go buy another gun. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're going to be really enthused, just like if you're in a group of people who are committed to gun control, and you're going to be more, and you don't have somebody who's dissenting who might say, hey, this policy provision that you really, really like, it may not have the effects that you want. And then you're going to be absolutely committed, and you're going to be more convinced that you're correct. And you can do this across issue after issue after issue. And what Sunstein found was that it can be so powerful, this group dynamic, that at the end of a deliberation, an entire group can be more radical than the most radical person at the start of the deliberation. So this is like a cascade, the whole group. And the interesting thing is you see this playing out in a lot of the social science and the polling around issues that we used to have this bell curve that described American ideologies, this big middle and these small extremes, and it's flattening and flattening and flattening to the point we have bigger and bigger and bigger edges. And so what ends up happening as a result of this big sort is we become more separate from each other in our views and less apt to understand each other. And so that means if I don't understand where you're coming from and I don't hear your view, and when I do hear it, I'm far more likely to ascribe your point of view to ignorance, to malice, to perhaps even outright cruelty, than if I understand it and know you.
And I think the term that Sunstein uses is cascade effects.
Yeah.
So you take pre-deliberation tendencies as you lay it out, and then cascade effects, and boom, we're further apart than we were when we came into the room. So what explains you? Why is it that you are an Auburn fan and you follow Dame? And more seriously, I believe you identify as an evangelical
Mm-hmm.
Christian
Mm-hmm.
and a conservative,
Mm-hmm.
and you feel like you're, in some ways, it sounds like you're almost moving closer to the middle rather than to the edge you were just talking about. How does that happen for you?
Well, so this is sort of, and I talk about this in the book, and the first part of this story is not a good look for me. Okay, so I'm going to say something that's just not good about me and what changed. Okay. So I grew up my parents were McGovern Democrats, but from early in life, I was not just a Republican, I was a pretty partisan Republican. I was a Reagan Republican. I was the first club I joined in college in 1988 was the College Republicans. So I was a pretty partisan Republican. I was also a civil libertarian. So I defended free speech rights across the political spectrum and due process rights across the political spectrum, and did that for years and years and years. But I was a partisan Republican, and had particularly when I was in law school in the early 90s, some pretty negative experiences with sort of far left intolerance. And so I really was highly motivated. It wasn't like I treated people, I tried to treat people well, but I was pretty darn partisan. So I gave a speech. I'd enlisted in the military as an older guy.
Yeah.
I was 36 when I went to officer basic training and volunteered to go to Iraq. I had this sense that I couldn't, in good conscience, support the Iraq War without volunteering to serve in the Iraq War. And so my wife agreed that I should do this. And so I joined the military as an older guy and went. And that's a whole funny story, how people called me professor in basic training. But anyway, so I gave a speech. And I'm embarrassed about this speech to this day. And people asked me, hey, David, I was also a First Amendment attorney, representing a lot of mainly conservatives who are facing problems on campus. And they said, why would you go to Iraq when you're doing some work we like here? This was to a conservative audience. And I said these words. I said, I believe the two greatest threats to the United States are the radical left at home and jihadists abroad. And I feel called to combat both. And I, cheers, yay, I mean, like, that's like checking off all the boxes in conservative world. So I go to Iraq and with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. And I was a JAG officer, but I wasn't like the guy breaking down the doors, but I was outside the wire a ton. I was up close and personal in a year-long deployment that was very difficult in the heart of the surge, where we lost a lot of guys. It was very hard. And I saw, this was the precursor of the Islamic State. They were already transitioning from the Al-Qaeda in Iraq to the Islamic State. They were trying to set up a caliphate in eastern Iraq in Diyala province. And it was brutal. It was brutal. It was everything that you saw with the rise of ISIS in 2014, 2015, but it was in 2007, 2008 without all these viral videos and all of that. It's horrible. And I remember two things. One was I felt ashamed. Like I had lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I taught at Cornell Law School in Ithaca that had a socialist mayor at the time, if I remember correctly. I'd lived in Midtown Manhattan my first year of marriage, working at a big firm that was overwhelmingly left. The partners and lawyers were overwhelmingly on the left. And I had a good life.
Yeah.
Even though I had negative experiences with the far left in law school, 3 of the best years of my life. My son was born in Ithaca. I had friends and family in Midtown Manhattan, in Center City, Philly, where I worked for a civil liberties nonprofit. But in Iraq, if the Islamic State was in control of a city, I would not just not have a good life. I wouldn't be alive.
Right.
And so I realized that it was just foolish and wrong for me to equate a political opponent whose ideas I opposed and an enemy who would rather see me dead than alive. And I felt ashamed of the distinction. And then the other thing that I began to notice when I was in Iraq was that the nature of the civil conflict, it wasn't so much rooted in disagreement over big ideas, even though there were differences in ideas between Shia and Sunni. It wasn't even rooted in different policies, even though there were different policies between Shia and Sunni. It was rooted in deep grievances and anger. The Shia killed my uncle, the Sunni killed my cousin.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I come home and I feel ashamed at the sheer level of partisanship that I had, and deeply alarmed that you can have hatred based not so much in policy differences as in sort of grievances. And then I come home and all of a sudden I'm seeing a country where that feeling of animosity between right and left was growing, and the sense of grievance between right and left was growing. Like right and left have policy differences,
sure,
but they have deep grievance. I mean, consider this, on one of the more important policy issues of in present day America, the outgoing president who tried to launch an insurrection to preserve his power, and the incoming president had the same policy. They wanted $2,000 checks into every American pocket. And that's a big deal. Like, that's a big policy. That's hundreds of billions of dollars. But one was still willing to try to disrupt the entire constitutional system to stay in power. And now I know there are big differences in other areas, but so I began to see a huge amount of grievance. Mm-hmm. And at the same time that I was feeling a deep sense that we have to see each other as fellow citizens and not, and yes, ideological opponents, sure. Fellow citizens, fellow human beings created in the image of God, yes, absolutely mandatory. And that there is a giant difference between an opponent and an enemy. And so this was I was sort of zigging towards being worried about all of this stuff as the political culture was zagging towards polarization.
So I hope we'll go before too long towards how that happens, how it's possible for us to be more likely to see each other as opponents, but not enemies. And that reminds me of one of the phrases in the book where you said that the First Amendment operationalizes love of enemies. Maybe that wasn't in the book. Maybe you said it in a talk that I saw online somewhere, but that the First Amendment operationalizes love of enemies. And so then what it makes me wonder is, even what you said about working on college campuses for FIRE when you were doing free speech stuff, is on the one hand, people feel a sense of belonging, not really because of policy usually, but there's some deep group stuff going on.
Yeah, deep. Yeah. Often
related to a sense of grievance. And then there's the First Amendment and due process. And how can, like, your life in a way is a demonstration of the attachment to First Amendment and due process. How does that compete with, these are my people, damn it, and you people are against, like, how do
me and mine versus you and yours? Yeah, the essence of tribalism. Yeah. So here's what I've discovered. So the one thing that I have said, and I say in the book, and you've heard me, I've said something very similar to what you said, and that is that the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights are the golden rule operationalized. And so essentially it's a sort of an operationalized, legalized version of the golden rule. And by that, I mean, it's essentially fight for the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself. Mm-hmm. It's sort of a legal corollary to the golden rule. Fight for the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself. And there's two things about that. One is self-interested, and the other one is actually quite, with a lot of things, there can sometimes be a dovetail between principle and pragmatism.
Yeah.
A virtuous circle. So there's a virtuous circle between principle and pragmatism and fighting for the rights of others that you'd like to exercise yourself. One of them is, here's the self-interested part. Here's the pragmatic part. If you establish a legal precedent that defends the right of your political opponent, that legal precedent equally applies to your own activity. Uh-huh. So quite literally, by defending somebody else's free speech rights, you are defending your own. Mm-hmm. And so if you're in a position where the power is flipped and you need protection from the government, so when you defend, I'll give you a perfect example of this phenomenon. Several years ago, one of the most contentious religious liberty cases in America was the Hobby Lobby case. Mm-hmm. This is the case where Hobby Lobby wanted to opt out of part of the Obamacare contraceptive mandate. And they won. highly contentious 5-4 case. They were allowed to opt out of part of the mandate. Fast forward several years, and a lot of people on the left were pretty upset about the Hobby Lobby decision. Fast forward several years, and some progressive Christian activists were arrested after putting food in some wilderness areas of Arizona along the border,
right,
that were saving the lives. That food was saving the lives of undocumented immigrants who were crossing the border in a really harsh terrain. And
yeah,
so that food and water was saving their lives, but it was criminal to leave it out. And so these activists, these progressive religious activists, were brought up in criminal charges. And they raised a religious liberty defense, that they were defending, that they had a religious obligation to welcome the stranger, so to speak, from using sort of biblical language. And they appealed to the same law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that Hobby Lobby appealed to. And the judge threw out the criminal case. And guess what was one of the cases they cited? The judge cited Hobby Lobby. Mm-hmm. And so that's the way rights work. It's not always do the good guys win and the bad guys lose, which is the way we look at all kinds of legal cases. It's, did a right that is mutually beneficial to all of us get vindicated, or did it not? So that's a very sort of pragmatic look at it. And here's the thing that I think is even deeper. And this is something I've discovered in defending people that I disagree with. You build a bond of fellowship with another human being when you defend their liberty. Mm. In fact, it's almost hard not to. Because when their liberty is at stake, from them, often it is one of the more important in one of the most severe crises of their life.
Yeah.
Especially if that liberty that is at stake is especially if what's at stake includes whether or not they're going to be imprisoned, for example. And so when you defend somebody's liberty, when you disagree with them, there are two things that occur at once. One, just through the course of it, you're going to form a relationship. Mm-hmm. And number two, you're going to also understand your opponent inside and out, because to defend them, you have to understand them.
Yeah.
And this isn't just for lawyers. One thing that I talk to people about is, look, if you see somebody who's your political opponent being dogpiled on Facebook, for example,
yeah,
and you know that there's a right here at issue that you care about, come to their aid.
Yeah.
Even on social media, come to their aid.
So there's a couple things I want to push a little further into, but first I just want to note the excellent phrase you just uttered. This isn't just for lawyers. I just feel like that phrase just needs to be put somewhere. It's pretty good. The more you're talking, the more I'm thinking about how interwoven religious language and political language seem to be. Mm-hmm. And I feel both the strength of that and the challenge of that. And so
the danger of it. Yeah.
The danger of it is a stronger
mm-hmm.
way to put it. And especially because you're talking a lot about rights.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about rights, I think about individuals and sort of, again, individual rights, individual freedoms, which feels quite different as a structure and as a motivator than, say, what's going on as a structure and a motivator on the religious side, which seems to me to be not about the individual principally. So I want to ask for you, how is it that you thread those two so closely together and feel like you're not moving into the realm that you just described as possibly dangerous?
Yeah, so one of the things, so as a Christian, a danger, and it's even a danger so severe that somebody would even compare it to idolatry, mm-hmm. would be holding a political view, holding a political position with religious intensity, or placing a level of faith in a politician that it should only be placed in God. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, where your political convictions and your personal allegiances become comparable to or even exceeding those of your theological convictions and the object of your faith. And so I think the holding of political views with religious intensity is an increasing issue on the left and on the right.
Can I stop you there and ask why?
Sure.
Why is it that politics has displaced other forms of allegiance in intensity and in identity?
I mean, it's in some places it's displaced family.
Yeah.
It's some place. Yeah. Well, because I think politics well, number one, I mean, when I say that, I don't want to denigrate politics, because politics is important.
Yeah.
It's important. How politics can achieve justice or create injustice. These things are very, very important. So it is even properly viewed in its particular context. It's important. Number two, though, it also connects you with other human beings in a way that can provide its own level of almost, there's this phrase, the ecstasy of crowds, that this sort of energy and meaning and purpose that can be generated through mass collective activity. I mean, the one of the things that are at my publication, the dispatch.com plug, one of the best things that we did was my colleague Andrew Egger, what really most interesting things is he profiled people who were, they followed Trump rallies like some people followed the Grateful Dead.
Yeah.
Or Fish, or, one of these. So in other words, it had become a part of a culture, a part of a community for them, the community of the rally, the experience of the rally. And so politics can often fill a void in community.
Yeah.
It can fill a void in friendship, because the people, not just a larger community of I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, but the precise friendship. I'm bonded to the volunteer I worked with on this campaign.
Yeah.
So it can provide community, it can provide relationship, it can provide purpose, and it can provide transcendence through the sort of that sort of the ecstasy of the crowd phenomenon. And so, interestingly enough, and I mean, we can circle back to where we began. Sports can occupy a quasi-religious place in somebody's heart.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that I began to realize that our political discourse was getting dangerously bad is when I noticed that it was almost as bad as your average sports message board.
Well, that's actually that's why I wanted to start there. So thanks for going back there. I mean,
sure.
There have been periods in my life when politics has not seemed like something you wake up and can't help but think about. And often the lament during those periods is apathy and disengagement. And bonfire of the vanities kind of stuff, where other things matter more.
Right.
And I mean, there are a lot of problems right now, but one thing that doesn't seem to be a problem is engagement. And so I kind of want to ask, you say in the book, you talk about, again, written before we got to the fall and the early winter, but you say turbulence is not the same as a plane going down. It's not the same as the Flight 93 argument.
Right.
And someone like Martin Luther King, who also threads religion and politics together, talks about creative tension and the importance of creative tension. I guess I want to ask, do you have a sense of what's the right level of tension? What's the right level of engagement that doesn't spill over? And how do you get there and maintain it?
Well, one of the hardest things to achieve in political life is perspective, a sense of perspective and proportion. Okay. So there are times when politics and the political dispute at issue is of life and death importance. So, for example, if you're a Black American and you're confronting Jim Crow, I mean, that is sort of the archetype of the domestic political issue that is of absolutely vital. How vital of importance was it that the civil rights of Black Americans was the thing that split America to pieces in 1861 to 1865, and we almost fought again after the election of 1876, and it wasn't until Black Americans were thrown overboard yet again, and Reconstruction kind of really abandoned that, and so you had this situation where, think about the level of injustice that politics had visited upon Black Americans, and so think about the necessity of politics to alleviate that injustice. So that's sort of your archetype of politics as meaningful. Overseas, those are your decisions of war and peace. A decision to go to war is a political decision. This is and he or she who makes that decision can impact lives at the scale of millions. So that's your archetype of where absolutely it's important. Where Where I have begun to get incredibly alarmed is how we were now often begin to use language and ascribe importance of political disputes at a level far out of proportion to the actual importance of the conflict. The perfect example is the Flight 93 argument made in the Hillary Clinton-Donald Trump campaign. And the Flight 93 argument, for those viewers who don't know it or were blessed enough not to read the essay, essentially the argument was that if Hillary Clinton wins, America is over. Not might be over,
right?
Not is going to drift in a negative direction politically, is over. That the plane will crash. And so therefore you have to storm the cockpit with Donald Trump. And that's where I use my turbulence analogy. Right. But what if the plane isn't hijacked? What if the plane's just going through turbulence and you storm the cockpit anyway?
Yeah.
And so a big part of our political culture right now is the necessity of reforming our political culture is being able to match your emotion to the moment, or match your commitment to the importance of the moment. And there are two kinds of things that I have written that get the most pushback, because right now are just to refer to sort of the movie Spinal Tap.
Sure. Good. Always good.
Most of our political discourse keeps going to 11. It's like everything on the volume dial goes to 11. But there are two kinds of things that I've written in the past 5 years that get the most angry pushback. One, of course, is anything against Trump. And the other one is anything that I say that an issue is a problem and not a crisis. Because I think the fear is if you don't cast it as a crisis, then you run into apathy.
Yeah.
But the problem is if you cast things as a crisis, then often you have the wrong kind of conviction in engagement.
So again, there's lots here. And the work we've been doing out here at Oregon Humanities, I think, is to try to get people connecting across differences, not as crisis response, not in crisis response mode, but to decrease the likelihood of a crisis and to make it more likely that when a crisis hits, there's trust and there's some relationships and some practice of connecting with people who are different. I guess I want to ask about what you see as the ways to get people engaged without yelling crisis all the time, or without saying what you think is a crisis, I think is only a problem. Like, how do you, in other words, I'm starting to push from the sense of threat to the reform part, the restore part.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, not everybody has to be engaged about all things. So sometimes we sort of look at engagement as a value by itself, even if the engagement is not informed engagement, for example. And just to take one example, so I think in a diverse nation where people aren't just diverse on all of the markers like race and ethnicity and sexual orientation and gender identity and all of these different ways in which we're different. We're also diverse in our interests. You know, we're diverse in the things that we care about, the things that we're knowledgeable about. And one of the functions of a sort of a healthy body politic is the people, for example, who care about the school board or engage with the school board, whereas the people who care about the urban planning of the downtown are engaged with the urban planning of the downtown. And we don't all one of the disadvantages of being sort of in the pundit / commentator field is people think that I have an opinion on everything, and I have opinions on some things that are so ill-informed, you don't want to hear my opinion. And then there are some things I don't have an opinion on. And God bless those people who do and engage, who are engaged and informed and go do that work. Great, more power to you. But so my issue is I don't look at mass engagement as the goal. I look at informed and reasonable engagement as a goal. And I think that's a more important goal than mass engagement. And so the problem with the crisis mentality is people are looking at mass engagement, sort of this test of strength, as the goal, even at the expense of positively misinforming people to get the engagement.
Yeah. So it's interesting. While you were talking, I was still thinking about how we work towards less of the cascade effects or fewer of the cascade effects, more capacity to understand each other. And I was thinking about what you said about the Flight 93 threat, America is over, which reminded me of the moment in the book when you say what you see as the solution, that you see 18th century solutions to 21st century problems.
Right.
And I wonder if you could spell that out just a little bit. It's tied up to me to the question of like, what does it mean for America to be over or not?
Yeah. Well, when I say 18th century solutions, I immediately refer to Federalist number 10, which is my favorite Federalist paper and should be everybody's favorite Federalist paper. And this is James Madison wrestling with the question that was really a salient, dominant question in the minds of a lot of the more forward-thinking founders. And that is, how did you deal with what they would times we want to look back at the founding and we want to say something along the lines of, well, that wasn't very diverse because the people who are all really engaged in it were property owning, either Christian or Christian friendly, English speaking white males. So that's through our frame, that's not diverse. That's the opposite of diverse.
Right.
Within their frame, they were dealing with diversity in a pretty tangible way. And that sense was they had running up and down the eastern seaboard of the US, the different worldviews and theologies that comprised the combatants of the wars of religion that were responsible for the wars of religion until arguably the Napoleonic Wars and certainly World War I were the most destructive conflicts on the European continent. And so how do you knit together one nation that does not have the same faith? Now, people would say now, well, it's Christianity, but no, the wars of religion were wars between Christians without the same faith, with different economic systems. And so what Madison said is what we essentially have to do is we have to, rather than having one faction dominate the others, we have to have many factions. And this is an early statement of American pluralism, that instead of worrying about one faction dominating the rest, we should try to cultivate a fertile field of many factions.
Yeah.
And that's a sort of a early version of pluralism. It's not me or you, it's me and you. And it's you and you and you.
Right. To extend the sphere but it's interesting because many factions can then, right, you can tilt over into, well, there's actually two sides on the right that want to go after each other and two sides on the left that want to go each other. So it feels to me like, in a way, it gets back to that same question of how do you get to the healthy level rather than the harmful.
Yeah. Well, and that's where the Bill of Rights comes in. So what you have in a pluralistic society is, yes, you're going to have different communities living according to different values, but that would lead to an awful lot of fracture unless there's some commonality, unless there's some sort of fundamental element that is part of the American social compact. And what I would say is the American social compact, boiled down to its essence, is personified in the Bill of Rights as extended and amplified by the Civil War amendments. And so if you take the Declaration of Independence as sort of like the mission statement of a corporation, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That has no legal force and effect. It's a declaration of purpose and intent. Well, how do you put that into practice? Well, you put that into practice through the Bill of Rights, protecting free speech, protecting rights of due process, protecting freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, unreasonable searches and seizures. And then moving into the Civil War amendments, which correct the fatal flaw of the Bill of Rights initially, which is that they only restrained the federal government and allowed the state governments to trample on individual liberty almost in an unrestrained manner, and certainly with respect to slaves in an actually unrestrained manner. Mm-hmm. And so the Civil War amendments correct that by making these blessings of liberty extend, at least in theory, to all Americans, although we still haven't extended that as to match our aspirations.
Yeah.
And then also putting in place the very key notion of equal protection under the law. And so, in essence, the way to make federalism or localism or subsidiarity just within the American Republic is to say that there is this basic baseline level of human rights and civil liberties that are just part of being in the shores of the United States of America, and they can't be abrogated anywhere. Not in Williamson County, not in Multnomah County, not in Berkeley, not in Montgomery, Alabama. They can't be negated anywhere. And this is the baseline security you have as a member of this society. And then beyond that, there can be a ton of experimentation. Mm-hmm. Let's have a different tax policy. Let's have a different healthcare policy. Let's have a different climate policy. And within that experimentation, we still have these baseline levels of civil liberty.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought the argument for federalism is an interesting one, and it's always vexed to think, when is it good to have these different labs where people can experiment, do their own thing, and when is it that we need the force of the federal government to ensure a certain floor? Otherwise, we're really doing damage.
Right.
I want to, even the phrase blessings of liberty pushes me back to questions about the relationship between religion and politics. Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you about some of the words that you've used tonight, and also that I've heard you use in other places, and maybe, and they feel less systemic and more internal. And here I'm thinking of words like righteousness, which sounds like a problem in many cases. Mm-hmm. And then a word like grace, which shows up increasingly toward the end of your book. Right. And so can I just ask you, for you now, and now not in diagnostician mode, but for yourself, where do words like righteousness and grace show up, especially when you're the object of the kind of stuff you've been the object of?
Well, I mean, I've written this many times. I believe that human beings need forgiveness like we need air. That it is so difficult to even live in the world without forgiveness, because we're all imperfect. We all make mistakes. Even if you have some of the best intentions in the world, I've seen well-intentioned catastrophic mistakes. And then we don't always have great intentions. And so I think that we human beings need forgiveness. We absolutely need forgiveness. And so it is very difficult to keep together just on a basic human level. It's very difficult to keep together a family without forgiveness. It's hard to keep together a civic association, a club, a sports team. I mean, you name it. It's just hard to do without forgiveness. And one of the things that is most vexing to me about our current cultural trends is we seem to be aiming towards denying people forgiveness more than granting them forgiveness. And we had this conversation on our podcast, our Dispatch podcast, because all of us over at the Dispatch have critiqued Trump pretty strongly and faced various degrees of pretty ridiculously intense blowback. And so we had this discussion about what happens if somebody says they're sorry, and what if they, were not, let's just even leave it from the standpoint of somebody who didn't threaten you, but somebody who just was malicious and cruel and uncharitable and vicious. And the point that I made is, my basic view is, if somebody's going to say they're sorry, my basic view is I'm going to say, I forgive you. And if somebody wants to join with me, even after years or weeks or months of being what I would deem part of the problem, then I want to say, welcome, brother. And I've used a religious comparison. If anyone is watching who's been a part of a church that has an altar call, like a lot of churches at the very end of church, they'll have an altar call and they'll say, if any of you has sinned and seeks repentance, please come forward. And people will come forward, often very emotionally, and pray for forgiveness, and people will pray with them. And in all the years that I've been in churches where people have an altar call, and someone comes forward, and let's say somebody has come forward and know that they've been involved in some bad stuff. What I've never seen is somebody take a rolled up church bulletin and smack them on the back of the head when they're coming forward and saying, you should have done that a year ago. Instead people embrace them and they say, welcome. Now that doesn't mean you then immediately put that person in charge of the church. It might mean you have some wisdom that you engage in with how much you trust them going forward. But the actual operation of forgiveness should be, in my view, if you believe it and perceive it to be sincere, is that forgiveness is just necessary. It's just necessary. And what's very sad to me is what we have as a world now, where often somebody can say, I'm sorry, and then just be immediately dogpiled for not having done it earlier or having been wrong in the first place. And what that does is it deters apologies.
Yeah.
Like, why would I apologize if it's just going to be, if all that means is I'm then going to be taken as admitting wrongdoing, and then I'm going to receive the punishment for which I am due, allegedly, according to sort of the mentality of the online world, you're going to really deter it. But if instead you say, if somebody says, I'm sorry, and the response is, I forgive you, and welcome, brother or sister, what are you going to do? You're going to incentivize forgiveness.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the challenge is sort of accountability and maybe even justice on one hand, and forgiveness or mercy on the other. And it's a tough one.
It's not easy, because justice is important, especially when you're talking justice is, in many ways, justice is a form of kindness. Like an unjust society is a society that's often cruel and malicious and vindictive. And I talk about in the book, I mean, there's this scripture, Micah 6:8, that I think is one of the more beautiful scriptures in the Bible, that says, what does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? And it says to act justly. So justice is important. To love kindness, and love, depending on the translation, love mercy or love kindness. So kindness is vital. And then here's the last prong: to walk humbly before the Lord your God. And that, to me, those three interlocking obligations are so potent, because harmonizing justice and mercy is difficult. And you have to be humble as you approach that challenge. And I have found that some of the most disarming words in the English language, let's say you're walking into a tough conversation, hard conversation about racial justice, ameliorating the effects of, for example, the 345 years of violently enforced racial discrimination in the United States, violently protected and judicially enforced racial discrimination in the US. And you're trying to unring that bell as much as you can. I found that just walking in and saying, I want to achieve a just result, and figuring out how to do it is hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. And I want to hear from all those who share that goal, because it's hard and I don't have all the answers. And what I found is that, especially if you're walking in from a standpoint of someone who's being perceived as sort of part of the know-it-all class of America, I think that it's very disarming, and it immediately builds a sense of fellowship. Because if you walk into a super difficult situation with a posture of humility, that is so countercultural these days, it's so countercultural that it can be immediately disarming.
And disarming, such a great word, actually, right now. We should move to a close, and I want to say to people that are watching that below the picture, there should be a link if you want to join the breakout discussions that follow, that will be facilitated by my colleague at Oregon Humanities, Roselle Medina. So that'll be available in just a couple minutes. Before we go, talking about the way to walk into that room, so that other people can be disarmed, pushes me back to the question of how I can disarm myself. And I don't know scripture the way you do. I do know that for me, one of the most important passages in any book is in 2 Samuel, when David stays home doesn't go to war,
Mhm.
and sends for and takes Bathsheba
Mhm.
and does some bad things, and then sends Uriah to war to be killed.
Mhm.
But he's doing all that stuff, and it's fine. He's good with it.
He's good with it until
He's good
Nathan
with it
comes. Yeah.
until Nathan comes. So that's what I want to ask,
Mhm.
is that, like, for me, a prophet is not going to do it. And I worry if I have to count on a prophet coming. What's going to help me recognize the injustice that I might be doing?
Yeah, that's a great. I think when you open, you're already, in my view, I know for me, um, the recognition that I might be doing injustice,
Uh,
even even just getting there,
yeah.
cracking open the door that I might be wrong is 2/3 of the battle. Now, getting someone to point of I'm totally right to I might be wrong
Right.
is such an individualized
Yeah.
process. Okay, it's about meeting people where they are. And I think if you, to go back to the biblical story, Nathan meets David in a very different way than than you would expect, like walking in and said, you did. He walks into David and he says, I'm going to tell you a story.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you a story. And it's a story of an obvious injustice.
It's an
And
amazing
David,
story.
the righteous king, is saying, that was unjust. And then Nathan turns around and goes, oh yeah, that's what you did.
It says,
And
thou art the man.
thou art the man.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of it is knowing people, meeting them where they are. And that's hard. And then also accept that sometimes you can't
Yeah.
sometimes you can't get through. And sometimes it is important to just step back and wait. I wrote a piece some time ago where I said, I think it's hard to truly understand a lot of the really fanatical illiberalism that you're seeing right now in this country unless you've had experience with fundamentalism. And because, as we were talking about earlier, that what's happened with an awful lot of people is something is taking an absolute religious primacy in their lives. Now, that doesn't mean, I know people for whom politics is very super dear to them, but they're also super gracious people. Not all religion is fundamentalism, right? There is a kind of religion that is not, and there's a kind of religion that is. And so, but the kind of religion that is fundamentalist is what I called as one that it lacks any existential humility. And you don't tend to browbeat people out of that. You don't tend to shame or browbeat people out of it. You much more likely tend to sort of love or weight them out of it. Because one of the things about a lot of these fundamentalist style movements is they're ultimately quite immiserating. They're not like life-giving. They're kind of immiserating over time. And so what you want to do is provide a consistent, patient alternative at the same time that you do your best to ameliorate the movement.
All right. So I want to, this is making me even more anxious to get to the next phase where people can talk to each other and listen to each other in small groups. And before we go, I want to say two things. First, I want to say that in about 2 weeks, we're going to have our next Consider This program with Hari Hahn coming in to talk about democratic participation, especially for communities that have faced barriers to that. I hope viewers will consider joining us for that. The bigger thing I want to say, David, I want to say a huge thank you both for the content of what you have shared tonight and in books and on the podcast and elsewhere, but also for what you model. I think you model a kind of thoughtfulness and political courage, which we need more of. And I just really appreciate, and I'm glad we could connect from Tennessee to Oregon. My hope is that before too long, we can do something like this in person and more people can be involved with that. For now, I just want to say a huge thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. And we'll continue to be basketball friends until that day when Ja Morant and Dame Lillard face off.
All right. That sounds
At which
good.
point my tribalism will emerge.
And so will Dame's last second 3-pointer. So, all right.
I have no doubt.
Thanks so much. And I hope people will join us on the Zoom.